All right. Hello, 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 and welcome all to the opening ceremony of Curious's UniCon. I really can't express how excited the Curious team is to see all of you today on the cusp of discovering all that the Canadian university scene has to offer. So thank you all for registering, first of all. And for introduction's sake, I'm Lewis. I'm now the vice chair of Curious, although I've occupied many different positions in the organization over the past 2 years. I supervise Curious's internal affairs and long-term strategy, but feel free to reach out to me for anything you might need on the Curious Discord. To start things off, what is Curious? Well, Curious is a provincially registered pan-Canadian youth nonprofit dedicated to empowering students to be actors of future change through code and encouraging them to embrace social good as a main objective in their projects. We organize numerous events throughout the year, all oriented towards students and designed to provide you with resources in your coding journey. Among our most notable events are our Friday workshops, our Learnathon 21, our Bi-Hackathon Curious Hacks, and many more. And we're looking to expand this roster, so stay tuned for any more exciting events that you might see in the future. Of course, we're always innovating with our events, so if you guys have an event idea, feel free to reach out to us. We're currently looking for more executive members as well, so if you're a highly motivated Canadian student, feel free to check out our openings on our website. I can't wait to meet all of you.
So, hey guys, my name is Ryan. I'm the marketing coordinator at Curious, which means I manage her social media pages and I also carry out her promotional campaign. If you guys want to learn more about a mission and event, make sure to check out our website at curious.ca and follow us on our social media. We regularly post on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And we also have a YouTube channel, which is a great resource to consult for past events and workshops. Right before we kick things off, however, I'd like to announce the winner of her $25 Amazon gift card referral prize. So the winner is SAF1322. Congrats for you. You just won yourself a $25 Amazon gift card to use at your own discretion. Thank you for sharing the event with your community and stay curious. For the rest of you out there, though your luck hasn't run out, this event still has other prizes and giveaways in store that you can end up winning at the game night event that we are hosting tomorrow night at 8:30. Now, guys, I'll introduce you to our talented event lead, Leo Chan, which is going to talk to you about the event in more details. So I'm letting Leo talk.
Yep. Hello, I'm Liu Tian, and as Ryan mentioned, I am the events lead for Curious. That means I plan workshops, I plan events, I plan the schedule, and the events team or logistics team has worked very hard to bring this event to you all. And well, what is UniCon? You've worked up all this hype and we don't even know what it is. So, UniCon is your one-step Canadian university fair for all your favorite tech programs. Learn about and compare between tons of tech programs from Canada's top universities like Waterloo, University of Toronto, McGill, and many more. And you can compare and contrast them to choose the one that is best suited for you. So I guess here's a few sneak peeks at some of the activities planned for you. We have student panels from all the aforementioned universities and also University of Montreal and University of British Columbia, one-on-one coffee chat and mentorship sessions with current students at your dream universities, workshops on co-op, productivity, campus life, and also a speed networking event and a game night to connect you with fellow students. And we are very proud to say that our event is sponsored by Remo. So Remo is an interactive virtual event platform that empowers you to grow and engage your audience by offering you floor plan designs, unique environments, and a creative and distinct online presence. So let's dive right into the event. So the schedule of the event will kind of look like this. So Friday, November the 5th, which is today, right now, we will have the opening ceremony, which started around, 9 minutes ago, and also at that, which lasts until 8 p.m. And we will be featuring a speaker from Waterloo, which is Professor William Bishop. And right after this, after 30 minutes, we will have a panel from the University of Toronto, where you will get to learn about different programs there, which is going to be very fun. And tomorrow, we will be having more. We will start with a co-op workshop given by Parthrine, an engineering student from University of Waterloo who has done co-ops at Apple, Tesla, and Deloitte. And then after that, we'll jump right into the Waterloo panel where you will get to learn about all the different majors at Waterloo. And then we will dive into a speed networking session where you will get to meet some of your fellow participants, and also a coffee chat session where you will get to talk with the panelists that you will meet today and tomorrow. And I will hand this off to Christina to talk about the rest of the schedule.
Thanks, Leo. So as Leo mentioned, I am another one of the event leads. And what we do is we do bring new exciting events to Curious. So that brings us to the Saturday schedule. And from 6 to 7 EDT, if you're like me and like to procrastinate a little bit, then this workshop is for you. So this is the perfect workshop to learn how to get things done in less time and the tools that will help you. So our panelist is going to be a second-year computer science student at UBC, and they'll give you tips on how to stay productive, whether it's in school or in life, and do all the things you've been wanting to do. So after that, you can tune into our UBC panel where we have UBC undergraduates from various programs going over their experiences in tech inside and outside of school. Finally, to wrap everything up for Saturday, we have our Game Nights University Edition. So this is your chance to network and have fun with everyone in the event. So join us on our community Discord as the Curious community team has prepared a custom-made Guess the Canadian City game where you'll watch a short first-person street view of a city and vote for which city you think it is. So we also have a special prize for that event, which we will reveal later. So after a night of rest, you can join us for an event-packed Sunday. So you'll be able to tune into our University of McGill panel and hear from professors and undergraduates about their tech programs and more. Then with the help of the exciting Remo platform, you'll have another full hour to attend coffee chats and network in an interactive space with other participants. Finally, we'll have an exciting campus life workshop where you'll get answers to your most pressing questions, such as, how's university different from high school? What is the experience like? How's residence? And along with even more interesting questions. So this is also a chance to ask our panelists anything. So finally, in the evening, last but certainly not least, we have our University of Montreal panel. You hear about our unique tech programs from our amazing panelists. And to end everything off, we have a mentor session where you can speak to other participants, panelists, or undergrads for advice, networking, and various other opportunities. Finally, this will be followed by a closing ceremony where we hope everyone can join us for the big finale for our UniCon event. So that's our schedule. Next, we'll be introducing our amazing opening ceremony guest speaker. And I'll hand it off to Louis or Stephen.
Hello. So thank you so much, Christina, for that schedule. You can find that schedule and more on our website, curious.ca, if you wish to check it again. And we will be sending reminders in the Discord server, which itself is a reminder. If you haven't yet joined the Discord server, definitely do so. It's in the email that we sent you to sign up. Right now, without further ado, I will introduce our wonderful guest speaker, Professor William Bishop, Director of Admissions at the Faculty of Engineering at the University Waterloo.
Hello, thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to put my slides on the screen so that you can see them. There we go. So today I'm going to talk to you about preparing for a STEM future. I'm William Bishop. I'm the Director of Admissions at the Faculty of Engineering, and I've been a faculty member at the University of Waterloo since about 2003. I've seen a lot of students come to university and many succeed. And I'd like to give you some advice on how to first get into university and also how to succeed in university, and talk a little bit about some of the trends that I'm seeing in engineering and, of course, other STEM programs. Okay, so my presentation tonight will start with a brief discussion of the evolution of STEM. We'll look at how STEM is changing and how the fields that STEM professionals go into are changing, and how that's going to affect the types of things that you need to learn as you go through your programs, and also how that'll affect ultimately the trajectory of your career path. We'll then talk a little bit about some of the Canadian Engineering Grand Challenges and the types of challenges that Canadians are facing as they go into the next decade. I'll then talk specifically about how you apply to STEM programs and some of the challenges you face, but also some of the things that we look for in our applicants. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about how to improve your chances of admission to some of the top programs that you've heard about tonight. So first, let's start with a brief discussion of the evolution of STEM. So STEM, of course, is science, technology, engineering, and math, which I'm sure all of the attendees are quite familiar with. And it, of course, encompasses a broad range of subjects, but predominantly what we're talking about here are subjects related very strongly to mathematics and science. If we look at how STEM has evolved over the past 3 decades, we see that there's been a huge amount of technological innovation. In fact, the pace of innovation has been increasing. Certainly, there have been a lot of new technologies that have come about and become into the mainstream, and we see this transforming everything from the automotive sector to communications to, of course, computing and various other aspects of our lives. We see an increased need for diversity within the solutions that we're trying to find to the problems that we face. We're definitely seeing that employers are starting to recognize that there's a need for increased diversity, and we see some benefits from having increased diversity. So I'll talk about how that's changing the field of STEM as well. And most recently, we've seen kind of an erasure, if you will, of geographical boundaries. I'll talk about how that impacts us. So first, let's look at the pace of technological innovation. And the first thing to realize is that computers have advanced rapidly over the past 3 decades. And I wanted to try and come up with an example. I'm a computer engineer at heart. I thought, well, how can I demonstrate how much things have changed over the past 3 decades? So I thought back to the computers that I've owned over the years. And in 1990, I was lucky enough to own a computer. They were very expensive back then. My computer at the time cost 5,500 Canadian dollars. To put that into perspective, that was roughly 3 times the cost of my tuition. So they were not cheap devices to buy. And if you look at the speed of the computer, it was very modest. It'd be a 16 megahertz computer. It had a single processing core, which at the time was an Intel 386-based processor, which certainly you've probably never heard of. It had 2 megabytes of RAM, which was considered to be huge at the time. Most computers had 640 kilobytes of RAM, so 2 megabytes was quite generous. And I was lucky enough to have a 60 megabyte hard disk on the computer, which at the time was state of the art. If we fast forward to 2000, I was a grad student at that time. You know, I owned an Intel Pentium 4 computer. Now the clock speed was up to 1 gigahertz. The memory capacity had gone from 2 megabytes to 512 megabytes. And the storage capacity had gone up immensely as well. But the interesting thing to note is that the cost of the computer went down. And this is part of the reason why computers have become so big a part of our lives. Not only do they perform better than they used to, but also they're a lot cheaper. And we see this trend continuing as you go into 2010 and 2020. So my most recent computer that I purchased, of course, has an Intel i7 with 8 processor cores. It runs at approximately 4 gigahertz, has 32 gigabytes of RAM, which incidentally costs $200 to put into the computer. It's a relatively modest cost these days. The storage capacity is 1 terabyte, but it's an SSD as opposed to a hard disk, so it's a lot faster. And of course, the cost is less. It's $1,500. So if you look at the way that those characteristics have changed, we see improvements that are quite substantial. The cost is improved by 73%, and 73% cheaper than it was back in 1990. At the same time, the processing speed has gone up quite substantially by a huge amount, almost 25,000% if you look at the clock frequency, and 700% if you look at the processing cores. And if you look at the memory and storage capacity, that's where we've seen a huge improvement. Obviously, these have improved beyond what people could have imagined in the 1990s. So we find that computers are faster, smaller, and more energy efficient, and ultimately they've fundamentally changed our lives. Now, what about the new technologies that I talked about? Well, we've got artificial intelligence, which I think everybody's excited about the possibilities there. It's actually been around since the 1990s. It just hasn't taken off because there was never the processing power to make it a reality. Often we find that technologies exist well before they become popular because it takes time for those technologies to gain adoption or to become feasible. We have probably heard of Internet of Things. This is the embedding of devices in the systems around us. Basically, almost everything that you buy these days has a computer inside of it, and many of them now talk to the internet. You know, if you bought a TV back in the 1990s, it had no internet connection. But if you buy one today, I guarantee that it has an internet connection. And it probably has the ability to natively run Netflix and YouTube. Speech recognition is all around us. I won't mention all the names because that would probably just wake up a whole bunch of devices around the world. You have your favorite devices, whether they're from Google or Amazon or Apple or Samsung. They all have different speech recognition engines. And of course, Microsoft was one of the first ones with Cortana. And then we have image and video processing, which has enabled us to do autonomous vehicles and to do some really wondrous stuff. I mean, I was speaking with a researcher in Germany a few years ago, and they were automatically monitoring traffic cameras to determine when an accident had happened. And they could report the accident to the ambulance services and to the fire department before somebody would have the ability to phone in the accident, because they could tell by the traffic cameras that the traffic was backing up. We have, of course, 5G wireless communication coming to the forefront, and that's going to transform the ability to get data to handheld devices. And we see robotics and automation becoming more of a reality in our daily lives. And on the right-hand side, we see one of the robots that we have at the University of Waterloo and what we refer to as our Robo Hub. There's also an increased recognition that we need diversity in STEM. Employers have been starting to drive the need for increased diversity in the workplace because they realize that when they have diverse teams, they often have broader perspectives on problems, which can result in enhanced creativity, better decisions, increased productivity, and improved workplaces. So universities have been trying to meet this need in various ways. One of the things that we've been working very hard on in the field of engineering, of course, is gender diversity. But also racial diversity has come to the forefront, particularly recently. So we're really trying to make sure that the field of engineering and the field of STEM in general, including mathematics and science, resembles a cross-section of society. And that's definitely going to improve things for many people. Quite honestly, it'll mean that more people have access to careers in these fields, and ultimately the solutions that we're presented with are more likely to meet the needs of a broader society. And the last thing I want to talk about in kind of the evolution of STEM that I think is important is the removal of geographical boundaries. The pandemic, of course, has caused this to happen in a very rapid way. Employers have had to rethink the workplace. So employers have developed work from home policies, office environments have changed. Now we see conferences and business meetings evolving rapidly. And this tool that we're using today is a perfect example. Something like this did not exist, quite honestly, 3-4 years ago. But now there are multiple tools that have the functionality that we have here that allow us to bring people from various parts of the world together and interact in a productive way. So these geographic boundaries are really vanishing. And there's no reason to believe that we'll suddenly put the boundaries back up when the pandemic ends. So although we will ultimately get past this pandemic, it's increasingly clear that we'll never really return to what was pre-pandemic life. We will, of course, get back to doing the things that we love, like social events and going to concerts and going to movies and theaters and so on. But things that we used to do in the past, for example, business trips to go to a conference, might look quite a bit different. And certainly business travel will be different. We'll probably be working slightly different hours to accommodate communication with people in far off areas. But the advantage is, of course, all of the time that we'll save in travel in doing so. The other aspect of this is really important, and this is what you should be thinking about as an applicant to a STEM program, is that this new global perspective affects the career prospects that you have. You're no longer just searching for a job within your local region. Many employers now are quite happy to hire people who are located in a physically distant location, provided that they have adequate access to communication technologies. And this is going to fundamentally change the marketplace for jobs. And it also means that, quite honestly, it becomes all that more important to have a degree that's from an institution that's recognized worldwide. So this new global perspective is something that you really need to take into account. The other thing that I would point out, and certainly you're at the forefront of this, is that you need to develop new technical skills. And thankfully, I say that you're at the forefront for this because you're using these tools. You know how to use microphones and webcams and Zoom meetings and all of the things that are required for this modern workplace. Certainly, we're going to see more collaboration through programs like Teams. We'll be able to edit documents simultaneously using programs like Word and Google Docs and so on. Those skills are going to be really important in the workplace. And what we're probably going to find is that some of the older generation STEM professionals may struggle with the transition, quite honestly. So now the next thing I want to talk about is, where are we headed? So what are the big challenges facing Canadians? And quite honestly, this was a discussion point for the Engineering Deans of Canada. They decided that they wanted to come up with a list of what they felt were some of the big challenges that we were going to face as Canadians in society. What they came up with was this wonderful list of 6 challenges that we need to address over the next decade. So the first one is resilient infrastructure. And we can already see in the Ontario budget that was announced yesterday that there's lots of money going into infrastructure. And there's many reasons for this. I mean, one is that our infrastructure is aging. Another is that our infrastructure was not designed for the climate challenges that we have ahead. So, when we look at highways, for example, they were designed for certain temperatures and for certain amounts of rainfall. But those standard values may not apply the way they used to. We used to talk about the 100-year flood, for example, but now people are talking about the probability of the 1,000-year flood. So we have to start rethinking our infrastructure and coming up with ways of making it more resilient to all of the environmental factors that are out there. If we look at sustainable energy, that's going to be a huge one going forward. Look at the power grid that we have today. In fact, take a picture of it, quite honestly, because it's not going to look like it does right now, 10 years from now. It better not. Because if we electrify all of our vehicles, as we are certainly trying to do in many ways, our infrastructure needs to change substantially. We need to move away from having large generation stations to distributed generation. So, more solar, more wind powered stations that are geographically distributed. But also we have to think about how we get that power to the users. And certainly, part of this will be driven by the fact that there's actually a trend away from urbanization right now. That's partially happened because of the pandemic. Safe water is a big one, of course. Safe water in our communities is something that we should never take for granted. Even industrialized nations do run into problems with the adequate water supply, making sure that it's safe for drinking. We saw issues down in the US, in Michigan, which is not that far away from here, where people, unfortunately, due to poor infrastructure, found that they were being poisoned by the water that they were drinking. And just up north recently, we had the problem in Nunavut, where, quite honestly, the water was unsafe to drink. And that's a problem. And we need to make sure that that is not happening. Because we happen to have some of the best freshwater resources in the world, and it's important to make sure that they're safe to drink. If we look at sustainable cities, making sure that we can get to work is important. Part of that may go away because of the fact that we can work from. But we also have to think about how do we get to keep cities running, how keep the cities moving in the right direction. How do we ensure that buildings are maintained, that infrastructure is maintained? And how do we keep those cities safe as well? How do we tackle crime? Some of those problems may not seem like STEM problems, but in fact, STEM technologies can help immensely in keeping our cities safe. And then, of course, we have industrialization, which we're not going to completely abandon, of course. I mean, it'd be silly to think that we're going to suddenly move away from manufacturing. We do need goods. We rely upon goods. So how do we do this in a sustainable way? How do we make sure that the climate is not adversely affected by the development of products and goods that we need? And the last grand challenge is not a challenge in the sense of a problem that faces the average Canadian, but it's a problem in how do we ensure that we have an adequate supply of STEM professionals? And how do we make sure that those STEM professionals do in fact resemble a cross-section of society? So having inclusive STEM education is actually viewed as one of the grand challenges as well. So that just gives us an idea of where things are going. And the one thing I'd like to point out in general is that there's a lot of engineering disciplines and a lot of math and science disciplines that need to go into these solutions. We need biologists, we need medical professionals, we need, of course, transportation experts, we need people to build roads and highways and new forms of airports. We need, of course, electrical engineers to develop new ways of generating energy and also to distribute that energy effectively. So there's a ton of opportunities in all of the disciplines. One of the things I think we'll see is actually a resurgence of some of the older disciplines of engineering. So what's really the significance? That there's clearly a lot of opportunities for STEM professionals. They're going to be hired to work on these problems over the next decade. The problems are challenging, they're interdisciplinary, and they directly impact society. And probably the most interesting aspect of those 3 points is that the problems are challenging, because I know that when I was a high school student, I really wanted to seek out challenging problems. And the good news is there's no shortage of interesting and challenging problems ahead. And the last point that I'd make is that those traditional disciplines of civil engineering, electrical engineering, and mechanical engineering are going to see a resurgence to meet the needs of Canadians. But they probably will transform in a little way. One thing to note is that if you looked at what a civil engineer did, 3 decades ago, it's a little bit different than what they do today. You have to be a bit more technologically savvy. You have to perhaps design custom software to do analysis of various systems that you're working on. So often people overlook the fact that engineers from a broad set of disciplines actually will need programming experience. They're going to need understanding of tools that traditionally weren't associated with those fields, but now are very critical to those fields going forward. That's one of the reasons why at the University of Waterloo, all of our students in our engineering programs study programming in first year. So now let's talk about applying to STEM programs. The piece of advice that I'd give you on applying to STEM programs is really you have to take 5 steps. The first is to investigate your options. And you're taking the first step today, quite honestly, by attending UniCon and by looking at what the various universities have to offer you. But you have to go deeper than that. You really should be looking at the courses that they offer, look at how long the programs last, look at all of the different facilities that they have available. All of those things should factor into your decision. A key step that you should take is always to speak with current students, and you can do some of that networking through this event today. So I certainly encourage you to do that. But you can also reach out to students at the schools to ask them what they like about the programs, but more importantly, ask them what they don't like about the programs. You know, in general, I think people focus too much on the positives and not enough on the negatives. There are some negatives, and those are the things that are going to drive whether you're happy where you are or whether you're perhaps a little disappointed. So make sure that you understand what's great about the program, but also what you have to work through. Then you need to choose the right STEM program for you, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically, you have to be honest about what your needs are, what your goals are, and where you hope to be. You definitely want to make sure that you know the requirements and meet all of the requirements for admission. I'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, you have to keep working throughout your final year of study. So if you're in grade 12 right now, once you apply, you can't just say, okay, well, I applied. That's it. I don't need to worry. You have to keep working hard right to the finish line. So with respect to investigating your options, you want to match your skills and aptitudes to disciplines. If you're someone that likes drawing, for example, maybe civil engineering is great for you, or architectural engineering. If you're someone who really likes to be in the lab a lot, perhaps nanotechnology or biomedical engineering or chemical engineering might be a better fit. But you have to be honest about your skills and aptitudes and try to match them to the disciplines that are out there. And you want to determine a short list of the disciplines that interest you. And the most important word in that sentence is you. I think sometimes students give in to the wishes of their friends, their family, without paying enough attention to what they want to do. This is your future career. You want to make sure that you're doing something that you love to do. So it's very important that you're a part of this conversation, that you're the most important part of this conversation. You always want to search for colleges and universities that offer the disciplines. You may find that certain universities don't offer the program that you're looking for. Certainly, if students are looking for aerospace engineering, University of Waterloo does not offer a program in that. Not every program is offered by every university. So you might want to go to the University of Toronto, for example, which does have a dedicated aerospace engineering program. That being said, of course, you could take a related discipline and work in that field. And in fact, as a computer engineer, I did that myself. I actually worked for an aerospace company designing commercial flight training devices for Airbus A320s and Boeing 737s at one point in time in my career. And then finally, you need to compare the programs that are offered. And I have a tip at the bottom here. I've got a number of tips for you going forward. Keep in mind that programs that sound the same may be very different. So as an example, biomedical sciences is a great program that generally prepares a student to apply to become a medical doctor. If you want to become a doctor, that is really the field to go into. Biomedical engineering, while it sounds very similar, prepares a student to develop medical devices and systems to be used by doctors. So really, you're doing the engineering of products, of devices and systems that doctors will use, but it doesn't really give you the skill set that you want to become a professional doctor, right? So if you want to become a medical doctor, biomedical engineering is not the right path for you. It's going to be difficult to get the high grades that you need to get into med school, and you're not going to take enough of the biology courses that you need in order to really be well prepared for med school. So you would have to take extra courses outside of the core curriculum to do so. Now, I mentioned speaking with current students. All universities and colleges will offer opportunities to interact with students. Most will offer online chats of some sort, and in most cases, you are actually chatting with the student. There are programs in place where universities pay students to interact with prospective applicants. There are a few universities that use automated AI to interact with students. Generally speaking, you can tell because it's not very good. So you can usually tell the universities that actually put effort into it. You can often attend webinars. In fact, I have a series of webinars coming up on admissions tips and tricks that you can find on our university website at the University of Waterloo, where I'll be talking more about selecting programs, applying, and completing the interview. There's something called shadow days where you can come to campus and accompany a student to classes. And although these programs have typically been put on hold during the pandemic, it's my understanding that they're working to try to resume them. And there's some chance that shadow days will resume at the University of Waterloo in the winter term. It's not clear what the timeline will be, but the hope is to resume in the winter term. And of course, campus tours have resumed. And in fact, this has already happened at the University of Waterloo. Campus tours can be booked through our central recruiting office, and that allows you to visit the classrooms, the laboratories, the residences, and the athletic facilities. And one tip I can give you that I've learned as an admissions professional is that universities and colleges track all the interactions with prospective students. So they can use this message, this information to tailor messages to prospective students. So if you're wondering why one student in a high school class maybe got a different message than another student, it might simply be because of the fact that they interacted through a different program with the university, and as a result, they got flagged for a particular message. Usually that's the core of the reason why. It's not that they're trying to overlook a student in the pool, but that just amounts to what the difference is. Now, I talked about choosing the right STEM program for you. The questions you should ask yourself is, first, what will I learn from the program? And most often, students, I think, would answer this wrong. The most important things that you probably learn from a program are how to study independently, how to network with people, how to study complex subjects. The technical skills are actually kind of secondary in terms of what you actually learn from most programs, because if I look back to the skills that I learned when I was a university student, many of them I don't use today. And that's simply a side effect of the fact that technology is moving so quickly that the things that were relevant back in the 1980s are no longer relevant today. So it's important to understand that the most important things that you learn are usually soft skills. You also want to try to figure out, will the program have a good reputation when I graduate? So obviously schools that have had a great reputation in the past will most likely continue on that path. Will you gain experience in your field of study? In STEM, that's everything. At the University of Waterloo, when students go into our engineering programs, they graduate with 2 years of practical paid work experience. And that's why they're generally a leg up on the competition. I know other programs do offer co-ops, and many of them are doing a great job as well, but definitely look into what the differences are. At the University of Waterloo, you can get 6 co-op work terms at 6 different companies in 6 different locations and 6 different types of industries. That flexibility is really nice. A 1-year experience gives you more depth in a particular company, but you really only have one shot at that working. So that's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. And there are some schools that have something in between the two extremes. You want to look at how well equipped the school is. The good news is for the schools that are speaking at this event, they all have outstanding facilities. I've visited all but McGill, actually. I've visited U of T, I've visited UBC, I've visited the University of Montreal. The facilities are amazing, and McGill is a great school as well. So all the schools you'll be looking at over this weekend are fantastic schools, and they're well equipped. But definitely you want to keep in mind, do they have the facilities that you want for your studies? And the last question is really important. Are you likely to be happy in the program? Because if you're going to spend 4 or 5 years in a program, and many of the co-op programs are 5 years, you want to make sure that you're enjoying what you're doing. And one thing I can say here is that the right program really depends upon your goals, your situation, and your lifestyle. There are some students that when they come to the University of Waterloo, they struggle because they're outside of a big city, and they may have lived all their life in downtown Toronto, and coming to Waterloo seems like a small town by comparison. For some students that come to the University of Waterloo, it seems like a big city if they come from, say, a rural area. And we do have many students that come from, southwestern Ontario and so on, where it's less populated. So it really depends upon your lifestyle and what you're used to. Do you like large classes? Do you like being surrounded by a lot of people? Do you like, smaller classes? For some students, they're actually better off going to a much smaller engineering school or a smaller math or science program because that gives them the individual attention that they need. There are some students that thrive on pressure. And of course, the most competitive schools will provide that pressure that students thrive on. But some students really crumble under that pressure. And that doesn't mean that you won't be a great STEM professional. It certainly is quite possible that you will be, but it's something to keep in mind. And I just thought I'd throw up the programs that we offer at the University of Waterloo. So when you're thinking about, choosing the right program for you, I'll just point out that some of these programs are very computer oriented. For example, software engineering, computer engineering, where you spend a lot of time in front of a computer screen. There are other ones where you spend a lot of time in a lab, so like chemical engineering or nanotechnology engineering. There's some where you're outdoors, like civil engineering or environmental engineering or geological engineering. There's some where you spend a lot of time doing business courses like management engineering. That's also very computer intensive as well. So you have to be honest about, what you want to do and whether it's something that really makes sense for you. And of course, you need to make sure that you meet all the requirements for admission. So there are requirements that are quite obvious, the course requirements, but you want to make sure you have the required courses, the grades in those courses, as well as the overall averages that are required. And if you have to back those up with transcripts, you want to make sure that when you're applying that you upload those transcripts if it's your responsibility to do so. If an Ontario student applies through the Ontario University Application Center, they don't have to worry about transcripts. Language requirements are another thing that can come into play. Do you have enough years of instruction in English to not require a proof of language test? Or do you need to take something like a TOEFL or a Cambridge language assessment? Test requirements are becoming less popular these days, but some schools do require SATs and ACTs, particularly if you look south of the border to the US schools. And supplementary information is going to be required by most engineering schools and math programs and science programs. This could include essays. Architecture programs often have portfolios where you have to show samples of designs that you've done. You may have to do interviews or supplementary forms. For example, at the University of Waterloo, we have an admission information form. And of course, one of the requirements is processing fees. This is relatively new, but most of the big schools now have an application processing fee in addition to the fee that you pay to the application center. It's important to realize that competitive programs obviously require more than the minimum, but in some cases, you may find less competitive programs have the ability to waive requirements. So I always recommend that students take a chance on a program. You know, if they're at the cutoff or at the borderline, definitely apply to the program that you want, not simply the program you think will admit you. Because there is a lot of competition for students out there, and often we have to give out many more admission offers than students that we expect to accept. So there's a chance that you may get admitted even with a slightly lower average. And certainly in the situation that we're in right now, coming out of the pandemic, that's even more likely, because at some point I would expect the averages to drop back a little bit. They've been a little bit higher than they have been in previous years. And I suspect that's because of the trend towards online education. Just to give you a perspective on the types of things that are required for an engineering curriculum, the courses that we require at Waterloo are advanced functions, calculus and vectors, chemistry, physics, English, and one other 4U or 4M course. We have a minimum final grade of 70% in each course and a minimum average of 85% required. Now, of course, you know, if you're applying to a program like software engineering, an 85 average won't get you very far. You know, unless you had an amazing amount of programming experience, you probably wouldn't get considered with an 85% average. But other programs, if you look towards, you know, like civil engineering, perhaps management engineering, electrical engineering, these will probably admit students regularly from the 85 to 89% range. So, you know, there are programs out there where you do have a good shot of getting in. Now, the last point I had on applying is that you have to keep working hard right to the finish line. So this is a really good tip that most people don't think about. For competitive programs, of course, most admission decisions are made in May, but you may not know that most scholarship decisions are made in May as well. And if you gain a few marks on a course grade, this may allow you to get an admission offer, but even more so, it may also allow you to get a scholarship that you weren't previously eligible for. And in fact, if we offer you a scholarship early, so if we offer you admission in March and we offer you a base level scholarship, you may find that that offer improves in May once we have an understanding of the entire pool of applicants and we look at more grade information from your school. So if your grades have gone up, you might get a better offer. So that's always important to note. It's also important to note that offers can be conditional. And in fact, at the University of Waterloo, many of our offers are. So that means that if you lose marks on a course, it could lead to the revocation of an offer. Now, we don't take that lightly. Obviously, if you miss by 1 mark, you know, there's a decision that's made as to whether we'll revoke or not. But we do have to revoke offers every year to certain students. Now, the last thing I wanted to leave you with today is kind of a discussion of how do you improve your chances of admission. And in this section, I'm just going to talk about 5 things. Prioritizing information on your application, demonstrating a passion for your field of study, being honest, focusing your energy, and taking advantage of all opportunities. So as far as prioritizing your information goes, you always want to make sure that your motivation for applying is clear. You know, if you're applying because, you know, you're inspired by a relative, mention that on your application. It's great to know. If you're applying because there's a particular problem that interests you, mention that on your application. And when you're listing your activities that relate to the things that you've done in high school, always list the most important activities first. But some people have a hard time distinguishing what's important. So the first thing to note is that recent activities are more important than activities from the distant past. The second thing to note is that activities with significant time commitments are very important. So although, it may not lead to you winning, say, FIRST Robotics, if you're involved in FIRST Robotics and you're spending 5 hours a week on that activity, that's a significant time investment. Whereas if you're writing one math contest, that may not be as significant of a time commitment. So it's good to highlight how much time you spent on the activities, because that affects your grades in other ways, and that's how we assess those. It's also important to demonstrate activities that have earned you soft skills. And this could be something that's outside of course, the STEM field itself. Whether it's working a paper route, whether it's playing a musical instrument, being promoted to band leader, if you will, in a band. That demonstrates some soft skills, right? So there's lots of different things out there that can show leadership, communication skills, time management skills. All of those soft skills are very important. And the last thing, of course, is any work or volunteer experience. That's clearly important, and particularly when you're applying to a field where co-op is required, and that's the case for engineering at the University of Waterloo. As far as demonstrating your passion for your field of study, you want to basically answer the question, why did you choose your field of study? What do you hope to learn? What goals would you like to achieve? And how do your past experiences relate to your field of study? So even if these questions weren't on an application form, if there's some way that you can answer these questions, that will improve the way that you're assessed on your admission application. Now, the next point is really important, and that is to be honest. An admissions officer can usually tell when applicants stretch the truth. If you're truly passionate about a field, you'll have a connection to the field. And if somebody says, I really want to be a programmer, but they've never attempted programming in their life, they haven't interacted with any programmers, it's hard to believe that that's true. Okay, so it's important to show, why are you connected to that field? What is that motivation, if you will? Another thing to note is that claims can often be verified online if there's any reason to search. If somebody claims to have won a competition, most competition results can be found online. Sometimes we can even determine information we shouldn't be able to determine, like grades. But certainly, if there was a reason to doubt grades, we might follow up with the school to say, are these grades correct? So keep in mind that, there can be cases where we follow up with people. And admission officers have reviewed thousands of applications. We don't expect the applicants to be perfect. You'd be surprised at some of the things applicants write. I've had a few applicants that have admitted to committing crimes. I don't recommend doing that. That's brutally honest. That's a sure way to not be admitted into a program. But you definitely want to portray yourself as being a realistic human. If you come across as being robotic or being perfect, that doesn't really build a connection with the admission officer that's looking at your application. And of course, another thing to keep in mind is that you should be able to focus your energy on things that you can control. This is probably my best tip that I can provide any applicant. Grades are, of course, the biggest factor in admissions decisions. So if you did nothing else, studying for your courses and getting your homework done on time is probably the best thing that you can do. But certainly setting aside sufficient time to prepare your application, that's something that you should be able to control. You've got the holidays coming up in December. Take advantage of that time to complete your application while you have some quiet time and you're not focused on homework. Treat all optional steps as required steps. So what I mean by that is if somebody says, oh, there's an optional interview that you can do it. It's going to improve your chances. You'll be much better off by doing that. Okay. Another thing that you should do is monitor your email regularly. Some students set up custom email accounts because they don't want to get interrupted by all the email that's being sent by universities. That's great, but if you don't monitor that email account, you might miss out on something important. You might have been offered a scholarship and you miss a deadline. Somebody might have asked to get an update on something that you're doing. If you didn't respond, maybe you miss out on an offer. So you have to monitor that email regularly because that's our primary point of contact for you. And on that note, when you're setting up your accounts with universities, make sure your email address is correct. Every year, there's a couple of students, it's not many, but there's a couple of students that don't set up their email correctly. And then they wonder after a couple of months why the university never contacted them. If a university has not contacted you within a month of applying, something is wrong. Every university will. So make sure that your account's set up correctly. And try to block out all the things you can't control. You can't control when courses have been scheduled. Is it the first quadmester, the last quadmester? You have no control over that. As admissions professionals, we're going to try to make sure that that's not an issue for you. But, that's something you can't control. If you had a bad competition result, maybe you were counting on doing really well in the programming competition to boost your application, but it didn't work out for you. That's not the end of the world. If you have a bad grade on one test, not the end of the world, but you got to put it out of your mind and focus on the things you can change, the things that are in the future, not the things that are in the past. So don't dwell on missed opportunities. Always look towards the future. And take advantage of all opportunities. So this is really my last content slide today. Complete all optional activities. I've already mentioned that before, but it's really important. Don't leave blanks on an application if you have something to add. I've had a number of students that thought, oh, that job's not all that significant, so I won't list it. Well, if you don't have any job to add to your list, add it. No matter how insignificant it may seem, put it on there. Don't leave blanks. And make sure you reach out to admissions officers if you have any questions about applications. Now, we have an email address at University of Waterloo for engineering applicants. It's enginfo@uarloo.ca. That is your best place to get information about the application process. And if you have any clarifications you need, you can always follow up with them. And I'll just leave you with some of the social media connections that we have at the University of Waterloo for engineering. Certainly, I encourage you to reach out for engineering or math or science, any of the programs that interest you. Math and science have similar links as well. We have a lot of videos on YouTube that talk about the application process and talk about how to select programs and how the programs differ. I certainly encourage you to check those out. And I'd just like to thank you for attending the presentation today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Bishop, for your insightful presentation. So we'll take questions right now related to Professor's presentation, and then there will also be a period of questions at the end related to the event. So if any of you have any questions for now, we'll take them. I'll read them through the Q&A tab in Remo. So first question up for Professor Bishop. Does Waterloo consider all grade 12 courses or only the top 6 admission average?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, when we calculate your admission average, it will only look at the top 6, the 5 required plus the 1 extra. But if you have something unusual on your transcript, it can always stick out. So if you took a 7th course that you failed, we might try to figure out what happened here. And it's not like that's going to block you from being admitted, but as an admission officer, we're always going to try to figure out what the story was. So maybe somebody got sick during a final exam. That's okay. It's kind of a course that was unrelated. We'll let it slide. But when we compute the average, it's always going to be the required 5 plus 1 additional.
All right, wonderful. There you go. Second question, do you have any tips for explaining unorthodox extracurricular activities? Most of my ECSs aren't, or ECs, sorry, aren't typical, but they have provided me with a lot of skills. I'm unsure on the best way to explain them.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is really to be honest about the ECs. Try to explain the soft skills that you got from them. I will say that unorthodox DCs are actually a great thing to have. Something that makes you look unique as an applicant will help make you memorable in an admissions officer's mind. And when we do our acceptance process at the University of Waterloo, it's not uncommon when we get down to the last couple of spaces in a program to look at the same applicant about 10 times from start to finish. So if we see an applicant that's really memorable and we see that name coming up many times, eventually you might just get an admission offer because of something that just stood out as being really interesting. So we've had some people that have had podcasts and radio shows. One had a TV show on CBC last year that really stood out as kind of interesting to us. Some of them do missionary work, where they go off to third world countries and build infrastructure. That can be really useful, particularly if you're applying for an engineering field where you do infrastructure, for example. But it really depends. I would say try to be as honest about the EC as you can and try to identify how you think you've grown as a result of doing the EC.
Wonderful. And what would you say to a student who isn't quite sure what program to pick?
Yeah, so, that's tricky, particularly if you're applying to a place like Waterloo, because we have direct entry programs. So you go straight into an engineering program of your choice. You have to do as much investigation into the programs as you possibly can. The best thing you could probably do is actually shadow a student who's in the program and find out what they like about the program, but also find out what they don't like. Because let's be honest, every student will like certain aspects of school, and they'll have certain aspects that they dislike. It's important to know whether you can tolerate those dislikes to enjoy the fruits of the things that you like.
And okay, the questions are really coming in droves now.
Okay. There's a question about shadowing a student during the pandemic.
Yes.
So I mentioned that's going to open up in January, I think. We'll know more in January for sure about whether that's going to reopen or not. But our hope is to reopen in the winter term, and that would give you an opportunity to do that. In the interim, your best option is probably to book a campus tour and actually come visit the campus. And you can actually just walk into certain spaces and actually see the students in action. So that's one way that you could meet up with students and actually ask them what they like. We have a building, Engineering 5 and Engineering 7, where a lot of engineering students tend to be in public spaces. Why not go and ask them what they like about the program? You're perfectly welcome to do that. Of course, if you're on campus, you have to wear a mask, but you can certainly walk up to a student and say, what do you like? What do you dislike?
And quick comment, quite a few curious execs are also students at Waterloo. So you can always ask them as well on the server.
Yeah,
if you feel comfortable doing so.
That's a great piece of advice. And we have the engineering chats as well, which you can look up on the University of Waterloo website, and that'll allow you to chat directly with engineering students and find out what they like about the program.
Here's another anonymous question. How does living in Quebec and being a CEGEP student affect admission?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And unfortunately, I can't give you a uniform answer, even for the University of Waterloo. I can tell you what the answer is for engineering, which is actually really positive for you. The fact is that we have adjustment factors that we assign to students from various schools and jurisdictions. And generally speaking, CEGEP students have a very good adjustment factor, which means that although they typically have lower grades when they're applying, they do tend to compete very strongly. And in fact, every year, software engineering has several SageEp students that get admitted into our program, and software engineering is the most competitive program to get into. So I would say it generally helps being a SageEp student in some ways. It's not a guarantee, though. And certainly the biggest problem for SageEp students for a program like software engineering is actually getting the programming experience, because a lot of the students struggle to take the courses that they need in the SageEp school and also have the programming experience that's required for software engineering.
Wonderful. So if you're in SageEp, definitely try and get that experience, and you can use Curious's programs to gain a little bit of that. Now, another question: how many extracurriculars would you recommend for a student who is applying to the U of W software engineering? Or how valuable are extracurriculars in applications? What ECs would you recommend?
Yeah, so it's not a hard number. It's really looking at the amount of hours that you devote to the extracurriculars. So you could have one extracurricular, but if it's a very significant one, that's as good as perhaps having 10 others. So that could be fine. I've had students in the past who have worked at Microsoft that have applied for software engineering. They were students that happened to be living in Washington State, and they may have had the luxury of their parents working at Microsoft, so maybe that's how they got the summer jobs there. But because they worked full time for a couple of years for Microsoft in their summer terms, that was a tremendous amount of experience that factored in heavily in their decisions. On the other hand, there's some students that won't have the same depth in one particular activity, but they'll have enough activities that it shows that they can manage their time wisely, and that they're clearly busy doing a lot of things. The one thing that is unique about software engineering is, of course, it's valuable to have some activities that relate to software development. It's not a requirement, though. You could have a programming course and then have extracurriculars in music and theater and dance and the arts and so on, and still get accepted to software. But you have to demonstrate somehow that you've got programming experience for that program.
Now, this is a question that I've often heard on the Curious server, actually. Are there certain extracurriculars that are more valuable than others in terms of what you're looking for in the ECs?
Yeah, so I mean, the one thing I'll say is that in the ECs, the one thing that is valuable that's separate is work experience or volunteer experience. That's treated differently than other ECs, like being on the basketball team or competing in a competition or something that's more academically focused. So generally speaking, you want to have some sort of experience, whether it's work or volunteer experience, and some sort of extracurricular activity beyond that. That would be a good idea in general.
Wonderful. And another question right here from Anonymous: should you mention extracurriculars that aren't in a club, for example, coding on your own?
Absolutely. In fact, that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that some people make, is that they don't include extracurriculars that somehow are not connected to the school that they attend. I've had a lot of students, for example, say, well, I don't have any extracurriculars, but I do play, soccer every week, or I'm on a community soccer league, or, they might be on a regional basketball team or something like that, but they don't feel like they can count it because it wasn't playing for their high school basketball team. Extracurriculars are anything you do outside of your academic curriculum. So that could be something that's supported by a school, but it could also be something that's entirely independent. And some of the best activities in some cases are ones that students take upon themselves. Maybe it's starting up a company or a club outside of the school. And certainly last year with the pandemic, we saw a lot of those types of activities from students who felt like they needed to do something when they were away from the school. And certainly the students that did those activities versus the ones that did nothing, the students that did activities like that were definitely ahead in the game.
That's actually how Curious got started, by the way.
Yeah, and Curious is not the only organization like this. There's
No.
actually another one that contacted us. I think it's ISEND, and there's a couple of
Yeah.
others as well. So, some of these organizations have come out of these desires to do something where they had the spare time and they needed to use it productively, and certainly that has helped students get a leg up into the admissions process.
Now here's another question. How much is one's grades / average considered compared to their ECs?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the basic way that we do it is that we assign a score to the admission information form. And the admission information form looks at extracurricular activities, it looks at experience, and it looks at fit. So those are the three components of a score. That score totals out of about 5, and we just add it to the admission average. So, a person might naively say, well, that can gain you 5 marks. But the reality is, there's an average score that students typically get. So a really outstanding student might be able to gain a couple of marks that way. The other interesting thing, though, that we have at the University of Waterloo is the interview. We also score that out of 5. So again, that can contribute another couple of marks there. So you can gain back about 4 or 5% if you're truly outstanding on the admission information form and the interview combined. But generally speaking, the grades are like the most important factor in an admission decision. If you have grades in the low 80s, it's a non-starter for the University of Waterloo. We have a hard minimum average of 85%. So that's an absolute requirement. And unless you have that, we just can't really work with you.
Here's another question, really short one. Does Codecademy count as an extracurricular?
Yeah, well, I mean, anything that you spend time on can count as an extracurricular, right? So, even if you were rigorously going through, programming problems online, like Project Euler, for example, or you could do something like that. If you can say how much time you spent on the activities and you can show that you've learned something from it, absolutely it can count. So again, self-study and self-learning can be part of that process. That being said, of course, I mean, there's going to be a limit to how much it counts, right? So, I mean, if you're comparing somebody that does something like that to somebody who actually worked in a company doing software development, I think everybody would agree that, self-studying programming versus actually programming in the workforce is going to win slightly. So, it's a relative skill.
Here's another question related to time, essentially. Are there only the grade 12 math and coding and whatnot competitions that are considered by the admissions officers, or are competitions from previous grades considered as well?
Yeah, so I had a student once that did really well on a grade 8 competition at the international level, and that was a minor factor in the decision. But generally speaking, the last 2 years are what we're really looking at. So that could be grade 11 or grade 12 typically. That's what we're most interested in. I would say that, any individual result on a competition helps, but it doesn't help as much as you might think it would, simply because of the fact that doing well on one particular competition is not necessarily indicative of strong performance. It could have been a competition that, for whatever reason, you happen to be well prepared for. So sometimes, I think people think, oh, if I get perfect on the math competition, I'm going to get in. That may be true, perhaps, for the math faculty because they design the competitions. But for engineering, for example, we just count it as another extracurricular activity in the set. And most of the applicants that we have for the highly competitive programs, they're going to have reasonably good competition results, not only at the local and regional levels, but typically at the provincial and national levels. For the less competitive programs, just participating is good enough.
All right, question here from Matthew. how do we determine how much time we spend a week on an activity if we spend a variable amount of time on the activity per week? So some weeks
Yes.
might be 10 hours, others might be 40.
So, I guess that's the challenge, right? Is if you're in grade 12 now, pay attention to how much time you're spending on things, because that's one of the questions that we'll ask you on our admission information form. Kind of keep a log of what you're doing. In general, that's a good idea, just in the field of STEM, to keep a log of what you're doing. These days, everything for me is on a calendar program, so I can go back after a year and look back at how many hours I spent on all of my different activities. So that's always a good idea to keep track of that. But it's, of course, an estimate. And I mean, for each person, it may be different. The fact that you spent 10 hours on something, if it should have taken you 2, is not necessarily a good thing. But if it's something that you took 10 hours to do and it should have taken 10 hours to do, that's great. So I always point that out as well, because sometimes people will say, oh, I spent 50 hours working on this project, and then it's really something that should have taken a couple of hours to complete. So we do kind of look at the activity as well to try and assess whether the hours are reasonable.
Here's a question related to pandemic activities. So essentially the value of certain activities during the pandemic. This, Matthew is asking again, will it be taken into account that it has been hard to compete internationally during the last 2 years in certain sports, esports, due to the pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously true that certain activities have been curtailed by the pandemic. Certainly physical sports are things that have been curtailed quite significantly. What we looked for then was kind of a shifting of those hours into other activities. A student that just said, oh, well, I used to be a competitive football player or basketball player. Now I can't do that, so I just sit at home. That's not a good answer. A better answer is to say, well, I'm now using that time for some other activity. And it doesn't really matter what the activity is. It doesn't have to be at the international level. We don't expect that. We want to see that you filled up that time with something useful. So, in most cases, what we saw last year is that students spent a lot more time actually doing online courses, whether it's through Coursera or some of the other tools that are out there. Some students were doing, pay courses through colleges online or universities online. That's another possibility. But definitely, we saw more coursework being happening. We also saw the advent of organizations, kind of like Curious, and there were many other organizations that got started up by students last year. And I think some of those were extremely valuable. Some helped out with the pandemic and trying to guide people to clinics for vaccines. Some were involved in trying to remove barriers so that people could attend the clinics in various ways. Some were just trying to track the data online, and there were some projects that were created just to analyze data and provide transparent data to the general public. So those were all great examples, but there were certainly many other examples as well. In some cases, people just focused on helping out family and friends, and they might have been required to take care of younger siblings or do more work around the house because their parents were unable to do so because of other activities that they were forced to do. So, it's just a matter of explaining how you're spending your time.
Here's a particularly interesting question. How does the University of Waterloo treat continuing education and gap year students?
Yeah, so gap year doesn't really matter too much to us as long as you use the time productively, right? So, I would say in general, if you want to take a gap year, the best way to do it is to apply from high school directly to university and then ask for a 1-year deferral. That's a very easy way to get that gap year and not have it affect your admission decision. But if you've taken a gap year and then you're applying to the university, as long as your grade 12 courses are recent, so if you took your grade 12 courses in your final year of high school and then you had a gap year, you're fine. There's not going to be any issue. We we simply want to see that those grade 12 courses have been completed within the past 2 years of you starting studying at the University of Waterloo. It gets a bit tricky if some of those grade 12 courses were taken in grade 11, but usually we allow that for one gap year. If you've taken more than one gap year, then it becomes more of a continuing ed type of approach where we may ask a student to retake a course. It's rare, but we do that in some cases.
Here's another question related to grades. So apparently on the fall 2021 admission averages, on your blog, that is, the admission averages for the fall of 2021 were considerably higher than in 2020. And the question asker is wondering whether or not it's because of grade inflation, or do you believe that it will be even higher for 2022?
Yeah, so that's almost the $1 million question, right? How much of that is grade inflation? How much of that is just more demand for our programs? Last year, we had a record number of applications. To put into perspective, we had 14,000 applications to engineering programs, and we admitted about 4,000 or gave out 4,000 admission offers, of which probably about 1,800 students materialized in this fall. And that's kind of a typical show rate that we have, a typical acceptance rate and show rate that we would typically have, which is among the best in kind of Canada. It's hard to say what's going to happen, but I will say that I've already seen that this year's application numbers are up from last year. Now, it is very early days, so I'm hesitant to say that it's going to be that we have higher numbers of applications this year than last year, because last year was a record. But if things track the way they are right now, I would not be surprised if we had 15,000 applications this year. So, if that's true, I would expect the averages might even move up a little bit higher because of that, just because, that really means there's more demand for a smaller number of spaces, and that means we have to be more selective. We have more great students to choose from. I do think that maybe there was a small piece last year that was related to grade inflation, but we don't really know yet. I mean, the Ontario University Application Centre will get a better idea of whether grade inflation was happening last year or not, because they're doing a large study looking at the applicants to all schools. And the problem is, if we just look at one school, we don't know if more strong applicants applied to Waterloo last year, and that's why the averages went up, or if it was that, there were some inflation going on at all of the schools that were out there. But certainly, I think, the averages are probably going to stay about the same this year, maybe go up slightly for some of the more moderate demand programs. It won't affect the top programs because there's nowhere for software engineering to go. It's already so high, it can't go much higher. I mean, it caps at 100%, so you can't really do much. So, I don't expect the top programs to go up much. In fact, if we looked at our grades last year, we saw that the top programs went up very little. It was actually the middle programs and the programs towards the bottom end of the spectrum that saw the averages increase by larger amounts. And I suspect some more of that may happen this year, but it's hard to say.
Here's another question relating to the blog. Is the graph, so there's a graph of admission averages on the blog that this person seems to be analyzing in detail. Is the graph simply a top 6 average versus chance of getting admitted based on data being plotted, or is it a mathematical model of sorts?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I think, the reference is probably to this graph here, so I might as well just bring it up and show it and kind of talk about it. So this is the graph for Canadian and permanent resident applicants, kind of grouped by programs. And when we look at the averages that are put into this particular computation, it's simply the average that we use for admission consideration without any adjustment factors, without taking into account the admission information form, interviews, any penalties assigned, or any bonuses assigned. So there's all sorts of things that can move our admission scores around, but this is really the required average. So the 5 required courses plus that 1 additional course. What we see is that for programs like architectural, chemical, civil, environmental, geological, management, nano, if you were to look at it last year, what's happened is it shifted a little bit more this way and then curves up. So it's kind of got a bit more of a shape. Last year it was kind of like this. It kind of went up a bit quicker. If you had like an 89 average, you were pretty close to like 70%, as I recall, of getting into those programs. That was actually the curve that changed the most. The software engineering curve looked almost exactly the same. The only difference was instead of it going up at 98, it went up at like 97.5 to the halfway point. So it was just shifted a little bit to the right. But the shift was like 0.5%. And if you look at how many more students we had applying to the program, that could just be that we had more applicants. Similarly, we had a shift in the middle as well. The shift in the middle was probably about 1%. And again, that could relate to the number of applicants because we saw a huge surge last year in computer engineering. They were over 2,000 applicants to the program for the first time, and in my experience anyways.
Here's another question relating to that graph. So out of the orange line, which I suppose is the one in the middle, which of the programs would you say is the most or least competitive?
Yeah, so, I'm always hesitant to answer that question. And I know there's always a great desire to have the answer to that question. The reality is that they all behave relatively the same. I would say that there's this tendency for electrical to be more towards the bottom end of the grouping and mechatronics and systems to be at the top, but it varies so significantly from one year to the next. So it could be that systems is like the number 3 program in one year, and it might be the number 6 or 7 in the next year. So it really does move around quite a bit, and that's why I'm really hesitant to say one program over another. I would say in general, though, computer's pretty strong. It's usually in the top 5. Mechatronics is pretty strong. It's often in the top 5, and systems is often in the top 5. Electrical and mechanical will tend to be the ones that are more often outside of the top 5. But the difference between them is less than 0.5%. So it's really not a statistically significant difference. So that's a good question, but it's hard to answer. From one year to the next, it'll change.
Here's a question relating to the top 6 averages, and more specifically to their breakdown. Do you look at the total average itself only, or do you take each course mark into consideration? For example, 598s and 180, or is that the same, for example, as 695? 695s.
Yeah, so I mean that's a good question. For students that are not near the boundary condition, the answer is that it doesn't matter, right? So if the average is sufficiently high enough that we're not really debating whether we're going to admit the student or not, it won't matter whether a student has 80 in English and 98s and everything else, or whether they have 95s across the board. When we get to the boundary conditions, so when we start handpicking, and we do what's called individual selection, so we're handpicking the last few students, you're kind of comparing back and forth. And sometimes it can be the case that when you're picking that last student, if you see one student that has straight 95s and another one that has one really low mark coupled with, higher marks, you might lean towards the straight 95s just because of the consistency of performance. And the rationale for that is actually fairly sound. What we find is that in engineering programs or math programs or science programs, there's some courses that you have to take that you just don't want to. There's a program in every course that people just don't want to take. It's always going to be the case. There's some things you like about programs and some things you don't. And a student that's more consistently good, even in the courses that they don't enjoy as much, will generally fare a little bit better in university. We need students that can not only excel in the courses that they love, but also will do surprisingly well in courses that they tolerate, if you will. Hopefully there's not many of those in a program, but we are aware that there are some.
If there are too many of them, you might want to reconsider your program.
Yeah, that's the other thing to think about, right? But right now at the University of Waterloo, for example, there's a mandatory English course that every student has to take, or a mandatory communications course, I should say. It's not like high school English. It's more like technical writing, and it's quite a bit different. But it's probably not what you signed up to do when you think about engineering or math or science. So that's just a course that you have to take, and obviously, if you do well in that, it's indicative of a very strong work ethic.
So we've got to wrap this up now. So I'll take one last question, and that is, do electrical engineering students get the same co-op opportunities as computer engineering, computer science, and software engineering?
So the answer is no. It's actually really easy to answer that one. Computer science offers the most flexibility of any of those programs, so it's important to realize that. Computer science is also the hardest program to get into at the University of Waterloo. It's even harder than software engineering to get into. The reason why computer science offers the most flexibility is it's not a cohort-based program, which means that you get to individually select your classes within a set of constraints. Software engineering, computer engineering, and electrical engineering all have a lot of prescribed or required courses because they're engineering accredited programs. And electrical engineering requires you to take courses in power systems that make it more difficult to take a lot of electives on the software side, just because they won't fit into your schedule. So I would say in general, EE doesn't give you the same opportunities as the other programs. In terms of flexibility, CS is the best. SE would be the second best because you can take courses both from computer science and from engineering. So you have the best of both worlds. It's actually a really good blend. Computer engineering is a lot less flexibility, and you may not be able to take all of the software courses that you want. And EE is definitely moving further away from that spectrum. You'd probably be better off, quite honestly, in terms of flexibility for courses, and then ultimately for being prepared for jobs, to take management engineering versus electrical engineering. Electrical engineering sets up really well for design challenges of the future, like how do we get power to power electrified cars, and all the infrastructure that we have, sustainable energy and so on. But it's less of a preparation for software engineering in general.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for Professor Bishop for your insight on Waterloo admissions, and thank you for coming and giving your presentation before the Q&A. That was particularly interesting, I thought. So we're reaching the end now of the opening ceremony for Curious's UniCon. This is not, of course, the last event of interest during UniCon. In fact, in 22 minutes, we'll have our U of T student panel where you'll be able to ask similar questions just like this, well, perhaps a little more related to student life, as Professor Bishop counseled you all to do. So tune in 22 minutes back here on Remo for that panel. We'll see you all then. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Stay curious.